a two, a one, two, three. Hey, beep 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 ba ba ba, ra ba 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 ba. I ate a late lunch today, and now I don't feel like cooking dinner, but if I don't, it'll go bad in the fridge. Also, this is a brand of roach trap that I recommend you do not buy. That's a pick of the week for you. Alright. Well, first pick of the week is not of this week, actually. This is Tales of the Human Target #1. This is from 2 or 3 weeks ago, I want to say. It was supposed to come in. There was a week where the owner was on vacation, and so it was just me and the assistant manager, and they had me help break down the new shit that week, and this was on the invoice, but it wasn't in the boxes at all. But then they didn't think it would be, I don't know, it was something where I was like, so is this just not coming? And if it was a book I didn't give a shit about, I probably wouldn't have thought twice about it. But I wanted it. So when the boss came back, I think we brought it up to him. And then this came in a few weeks later, and they just put it out on the shelf. What I'm saying is I have frustrations with my coworkers at times. Because I only happened to find this because the assistant manager was out of town this weekend, and so I had to work by myself a couple days this past week. And one of my tasks was to take all the returns off the new shelf. And then I ran across this. I was like, oh, you mean this? This wasn't a return, but I was like, okay, good. I'm glad I'm the only person who comes in the store that's interested in this character at all. I'm not even sure 100% what this is. Tom King and Greg Smallwood are doing the current Human Target series, the 7th issue of which finally just came out. I'm not sure what these other artists are in here. So I'm assuming usually when it's a Tales of something, it's an anthology. So maybe it's just King. Yeah, that's probably what it is. King writing short stories that these 4 draw. I'm pretty sure Kevin McGuire's an artist. I know Janine and Albuquerque are for sure. But anyway. Another beautiful Greg Smallwood cover, by the way. God damn, this guy's so good. Also, this week, I'm catching up. I got... Well, no, I'm not. I got some good reading time in this past week, but still not nearly enough to catch up. And so I'm still picking books that aren't, ongoing. For example, this Deadly Class isn't ongoing, but this is the final issue, number 56. And I'm not sure if I've even mentioned this book because, it's been going on for like 10 years, so I don't usually pick it for a pick of the week. Although I think I probably have. Regardless, thumbnail, Deadly Class is a comic book about high school for assassins, which it sounds ridiculous, and it is ridiculous, but the book itself is really pretty serious a lot of the time, and it's a completely silly premise, but it really works. Rick Remender is the writer on this, and he's very, very good at tapping into what I think can only be described as punk angst. Remender's about my age, I want to say, and you could tell, or I could tell right away when he started writing for Marvel. His first thing was a book called Fear Agent, which I still haven't read. And then he started writing for Marvel, and I remember him on The Punisher, or was it Punisher War Journal, one of those Punisher titles. And The Punisher in the 80s used to have a sidekick of a sort called Micro, and he was just a big fat guy. No, he wasn't. He wasn't just a big fat guy. He was like very 80s sort of computer nerd looking fella. Portly glasses, 5 o'clock shadow. And his son had been killed by criminals, hence why he was helping the Punisher in his particular war. That character got written out of the series by the time I graduated high school, and then Garth Ennis brought him back for a storyline wherein he got killed. So Remender gave him a new Micro. It was a younger guy, and he was a punk, and he had like a 7-second sticker on his laptop and stuff like that. Think like, you know, there's that, especially when you would see punks in comics in the 70s and 80s into the 90s, they were always street punks, toughs with mohawks, and you know, they looked like punk rockers, but I was a punk rocker growing up. Wasn't in that many roving gangs, as it turns out. I was in one gang, and if you weren't a cute girl, you had nothing to worry about from us. And if you were a cute girl, you had even less to worry about. My point is, Rick Remender is definitely a real punk rocker, and being a punk is fun. I wouldn't have it any other way, but it does come with its own kind of angst. Teen angst in general is nothing new, but when you're a punk rocker, when you're a teenager, you already kind of feel on the outside. Even the popular kids must. Maybe not, I don't know. That's just something the rest of us tell ourselves, maybe, but so when you're a punk rocker, I don't know. My point is, the main character of this book is pretty clearly Rick Remender, although I'm pretty sure Rick Remender did not go to a high school for assassins. But I think he's probably a couple years older than me, but the majority of the book takes place during my youth. And this last arc has been kind of every issue. I think I mentioned that. I think that's when I talked about this before, was when the first issue of this final arc started. There's not really much I can say without giving the game away at this point in the series. Frankly, I'm just excited to read this. It's been one of my favorite comics for the last 10 years or so. And Remender's done a lot of really great stuff in that time. Black Science is another favorite of mine, but that ended a few years ago. He's done some other really good stuff in that time, but nothing that's really hit me like this book has. So, yeah, it's like I'm excited to see how it ends, but it's definitely going to be bittersweet, you know. What are you going to do? Nothing gold can stay, Pony Boy. And then finally, this week, I have Crypt of Shadows, #1. Crypt of Shadows was Marvel's sort of anthology horror book of the 70s. And this was my pick of the week for the shop, too. And in my little write-up that I do. If you're not on the email list for the shop, I don't know why you would be. You can't sign up through the website, which I know is pretty dumb. At least you couldn't. We have like a new web developer, I think, but I don't know if that's the thing. I know at the shop itself, though, we have a clipboard. You can write your email on it. I don't know, so come by the shop sometime, I guess. And then you can get these. You can get my little recommend for the week, and it takes a lot less time than half an hour. The history of horror comics is pretty weird. Like it definitely, horror as a genre is a long and storied history, but in comics it takes a lot of weird turns, which I guess isn't that weird. Comics are weird. Comics are the redheaded stepchild of popular culture, or at least they were. I don't know about now. But so in the 50s you had some of the best comics ever made. A lot of them were horror comics, and most of them were done by EC Comics, which used to stand for Educational Comics, but then became Entertaining Comics. And Tales from the Crypt and all that stuff, and they were brilliant. And then Dr. Frederick Wortham led the charge for, you know, and there was the Kefauver hearings and all this shit. Senate Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency, and they traced the problem back to comic books. Finally, somebody figured out why American youths were so violent. It's got to be these comics, right? It's not that they're teenagers for the first time ever, the first generation to actually get to be teenagers. It's not. That's got nothing to do with it, I'm sure. It's comics. So, rather than get the government involved, comics publishers, except for EC obviously, said, hey, we'll put together our own censor board and we'll take care of this. And the government said, okay. And the rest of the industry was thrilled with this because EC was pounding the shit out of them on the market. So they essentially banned every, right down to specific words, everything that could be associated with an EC comic. Read a good comic. And, you know, made comics really for children at that point, which they hadn't always been. They were they were always popular with children, but they were popular with everyone when they first started. They were huge during World War II, and the GIs read them all the time. I think that's been the case for most wars since then. Well, probably not so much nowadays, but I know in Vietnam there were a lot of comics around, I want to say. I can't really say beyond that, but World War II they were huge. And in the 50s they were still very popular. Reading in general seems like it was more popular in the 50s, certainly more so than now. But there was not only comics, you had all the pulps and all the dime novels and all kinds of shit like that. Which there's always been analogous shit throughout time, but, you know, it's all digital now, so it's harder for me to keep track of it. So then you essentially had no horror in comics in the 60s. And the 60s was a great time for, like, Hitchcock got huge, and you had all kinds of crazy psychological shit you could do. And, you know, it's just generally speaking, morals were loosening and people weren't quite as uptight as they had been in the 50s. So that by the time the 70s roll around, then comics were allowed to be, they could have horror comics again. And so Crypt of Shadows was one of the books that Marvel came up with. To their eternal credit, and this as an avowed Marvel zombie, this sort of thing pains me to say as always, but DC definitely did way better with their horror. They had House of Secrets and House of Mystery, and they were just better. The people they had making those comics were better at it. But Marvel had some great stuff too. I mean, Moon Knight, not exactly a horror character, but he did have his first appearance in the pages of Werewolf by Night, and Man-Thing has always been considered, like, so there's all these weird. And this is a point I brought up in my little write-up, too, is that the 70s were also a time for self-exploration, the me decade, right? So, horror comics were a much... They'd skipped over all the... Well, not all of it. A lot of the... I think the way I phrased it was, in the 50s, horror was, we're all monsters, and in the 70s, horror was, I'm a monster. And so, especially with Man-Thing and Steve Gerber and his work, very existential. There was a lot more existential dread in the 70s. Perfect time for horror comics to come back. So this is my theory as to why, like, Marvel comics especially, but I think you could point to DC and say the same thing. Just weird horror stuff. Because they hadn't been able to do it for, you know, a generation, basically. So I'm hoping that's what is in store for me in this here cash grab during the Halloween season. I mean, $6 is not bad for this many pages. This is at least 48, if not 64. But could you tell? Are you impressed that I could tell by looking? Yeah, I mean, they do this shit all the time. Just about every holiday. Christmas for sure. Halloween usually. The big two will do like a Halloween special. That's usually about it. And summer sometimes. They don't do summer specials so much anymore, but that's enough for these picks of the week. Still can't tell if I want to eat dinner or not. I'm also trying to lay off the wacky tobacco for the rest of the month. Sober back half of October. Not out of any sort of health concerns or, you know, anything like that. It's just I got my tolerance is through the roof. I've been hanging out with Snoop Lion way too much, and so now every time I buy pot, I'm like, this doesn't even work. It's like paying for a 12-pack, but you only get one beer. You can't get drunk off one beer. Anyway, the reason I brought that up though is that's usually one of the reasons that I do smoke pot is because I don't have an appetite very often. It helps me sleep and it helps me eat, but I don't want to. So I don't know which one of these do I want to start. I'll go with this one. So first up, Follow Me Down, a Reckless book by Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips. Brilliant as always. Not much more I can say. The story itself is a really good revenge story, which is never not a good thing. Very a spit on your grave sort of revenge story too, which is always, there's something I've thought this before, and maybe I don't know, maybe it's just not as much of a thing. There's a often in crime fiction, which I've read a ton of. There's a tendency on the part of writers to kind of go for the easy bad guy, the easy villain, and they're child molesters or Nazis or some group of people that's just utterly repellent. So when you're reading it, it's like, oh, good, you're rooting for the good guy. But I for years have thought, like, you don't need to do that. If you want to do that, I mean, it works, but... And that's not entirely what we get here, but it is definitely a different take on, vilifying the... Now I'm just using too many $10 words. It's a revenge story on a sexual predator that didn't feel cheap. That's the problem with using... to keep it simple, you take sex predators and you make them the bad guy in something. It's too easy. Any asshole can do that. But if you can really build a story and have... And that's the other thing about Ed Brubaker, and he's of the same generation as Remender, and those two have always reminded me of each other. Not just because both their names end in ER. That's most of it, but not all of it. I just totally lost my train of thought. I did say I wasn't high, right? I did. Oh, that's what it was. I feel that the best sort of crime noir fiction should be existential. It should be, and it should kind of... This goes back to Chandler, too. This is not just my depression talking. If you've ever read The Big Sleep, I don't want to spoil almost 90-year-old novel, but the end is satisfying, but you're also like, but this guy... that was Chandler and Hammett's thing back then, was like trying to, ring the bell and like, hey, the rich are going to eat us if they feel like it. And it's similar. It's not the exact same, but you get to the end of this book and you're like, whoa, wow. And then you're also like, oh, fuck, everything sucks. Apparently they're going to take, there's a little afterword by Brubaker in this book, and apparently they're going to take a bit of a break, or they're going to work on something else, which is better than them just not doing anything. But they're going to come back with more Reckless books. Like I say, this was the 5th one, so, I mean, they've definitely earned a respite. But then it's going to be in the 90s, which part of this takes place in the early 2000s, and there was, I don't remember which one, I think it was the 3rd one, where we catch a glimpse of Ethan Reckless in the year 2020. So here that was a page. Here we get a whole chapter, basically, that takes place in 2004. And so it starts to fill in more of, like, who this guy is and how his life was after the 80s. Because, we know everything about him up into the 80s. We don't know anything, really, that happens after that, until now. So I'm really looking forward to it. It's such a good series. I just can't recommend it enough. And also, Year Zero, Volume 0, Number 1. This was really good stuff. First of all, I need to backtrack or walk back a little of what I said. I think I mentioned... So Daniel Kraus is not the original writer of this series. That would be Benjamin Percy. And I said something like... But it's Goran Suzuka drawing it. And so that's enough. I would have signed off on it anyway. But Daniel Kraus... And I didn't know this until I got to the afterword of this issue. He... finished George Romero's unfinished zombie novel. So, like, oh, okay, I think his pedigree checks out on writing zombie stories. It's called The Living Dead. I got it for my Kindle-y machine. Haven't had a chance to sink my teeth into it yet. But I'm looking forward to it. So the 4 disparate characters we have in this series is an airline hostess from South Africa, as the cover might imply. I mean, not necessarily, though, because all the covers have been kind of like this. But not necessarily, you know what I mean, tied into the story itself. We have a flight attendant from South Africa. We have a North Korean soldier guarding the DMZ, the border of the DMZ. We have a cop in St. Petersburg who is not dirty, but he is brutal. He's the good guy, but you know, his captain would not approve of his methods. And then, I just looked at it so I wouldn't have to do it while on camera. A fourth one. That's gonna drive me nuts now. Let's see if I can pull it. Nope, I gotta look. God damn it. North Korean soldier. See, that's why, because I said the air stewardess first when I meant to say her last. A nurse in rural Arkansas. And as promised, it's at the very, very beginning. I mean, year zero obviously implies that. But this is volume 0 of year 0. So we're almost into -1 now. It's stupid, but what are you going to do? So, yeah, it's great. It's exactly what I want. I want different zombie... I want the zombie apocalypse, but I definitely want that to happen. But I want to see what happens in all kinds of weird, different places. People. I would read a novel about a North Korean soldier guarding the DMZ if it was just that. But if you're going to drop him into the middle of a zombie apocalypse, well then... I already said I was going to read it. Why don't you get off my... Alright. That's enough of this.